Today I'm going to discuss hand sewing. So I have a variety of materials here, some thread. I have different weights here because I want you to be able to see it easily when I'm demonstrating. Normally, when we're hand sewing things, we will use just a regular sewing thread. This is Goodman Mara 100. This is a regular weight, same as you would put in a sewing machine. And these two are a little bit heavier weight, and I might use these for demonstration just so that you can see it more easily. I have a selection of needles here, embroidery needles, milliner's needles, and sharps. As you get better at hand sewing, you'll find that you develop a preference for something that you like, but they're also for different purposes. So these milliner's needles are a little bit longer. They can be, well, it depends on the project. Sometimes they're easier to handle and sometimes they're a bit cumbersome, but they allow you to load a lot of stitches on the needle, or if you're basting, these can be really useful. These are sharps. They've got a nice large eye, and they're pretty easy to use. They're just a very basic needle. And then embroidery needles also have a kind of a longer eye. They tend to be a little bit on the shorter side. So you'll just develop a preference over time. I strongly suggest that you start using a thimble as soon as you can. And I know that it is really difficult. It's really difficult to use a thimble. Generally speaking, for I guess the seamstress tradition, rather than the tailoring tradition, we tend to use it on our middle finger. If you end up going seriously into tailoring, then you might end up doing something different, but this is how I sew, so this is how I'm going to show you. So then the thimble should fit snugly on your middle finger. This one's a bit big for me, and it doesn't fall off, but it's not super comfortable because it's just a little bit too big. If you have very, very small fingers and it's very hard for you to find a thimble that fits, then keep your eye out at thrift stores, antique shops, vintage stores, that kind of thing, because those thimbles tend to be smaller. If you have very large fingers, I have pretty big fingers. I have found that the largest size available generally fits, but if you have bigger fingers than me, then you might need to look elsewhere. This one, which is too big for me, came from wawak.com, and it's their largest size, and it's actually a little bit too big for me, and it's quite a large size. If you have trouble threading needles, then you might want a needle threader. This is a needle threader. It has this thin wire, which is a lot easier to poke through the eye of the needle than a piece of thread. So you would just thread this wire through the eye of the needle. It's through the eye of the needle there. Then you can pass your thread through this diamond-shaped wire and then just pull it through, and that will help you a lot. Okay, I'm just going to move these things out of the way and we'll get started, and I'll show you how to set up to start sewing. Okay, here we go. I've cut a piece of thread about 1 foot long. This is a bit shorter than you'll probably use, but I just wanted to be able to show it on camera easily. When you first start, you'll want to start with shorter pieces of thread because it's easier to control. I have a needle here, and I'm going to thread the thread through the eye of the needle. Okay. Now, you want to pull it through, generally speaking, so that one tail is longer than the other. So this tail will actually be the thread that I'm sewing with. This bit is just kind of extra, and you'll pull it, like release more as you go. Something that can be really helpful to hand sewing is using beeswax. So this is actually this is called thread gloss, and it is made from beeswax. What these beeswaxes do is they coat your thread, and you just, sometimes they're just in a cake, sometimes they're in a little tin like this, and you just run your thread through it a couple of times. It coats the thread in beeswax, and that gives it a bit of strength. It also stops it from tangling, and for me, honestly, that is the most important thing. This one has got a scent to it. It is lime and sugarcane scented. So you can just get, you can get plain ones. You can also get non-animal product ones that are made from, I think, paraffin wax if you don't use animal products. Sometimes we do use the thread completely doubled over. Not very often. The most common instance of that would be if you're sewing a button on, you would want to make the tails the same length, knot them together, and then use it double because you want as much strength as possible for buttons. But for the purposes of today, I'm going to have one shorter and one longer. And now I'm going to tie a knot in the end. There are several methods you can use. You can just tie it in a knot. If you get in practice, I just turn it, twist it around my finger, and then I just roll it like this, and then grab and pull, and it makes a really big knot. And that is actually fairly ugly, but as long as I'm not sewing some very fine work, this is actually great because it's not going to pull through the fabric. I'll cut it off and show you again. Okay, I have the tail. I'm wrapping it around my finger one time. Okay, then I'm just gonna basically do this with my fingers, twisting it around, and then I'm just grabbing that and kind of pulling it through, and it makes a bit of a kind of big knot there. If that knot hurts your feelings because it's so messy, then you can tie a regular knot, or you can take the thread, fold it over the top of the needle. I have it looped around the needle. Okay, and then the loop of thread is here. You can helicopter it around a few times. Okay, then I'm holding the thread here and pulling this through, and that makes a bit of a neater knot. So most of the time you'll want to knot the end of your thread. I've knotted it singly. The only time you would not do that is if you are basting, and when we get to basting, I will show you how I do that. So I have a piece of muslin here. This is quite fine muslin, and I have my thread. I'm going to start off by coming up from underneath. Okay, my knot is secure here. Now I'm going to do a running stitch, and a running stitch is in and out. It's the kind of thing you probably did when you were a small child, when you were thinking of, what is sewing. It's just in and out. Okay, so we're going to go in with our needle and then out. Okay, you can use the thimble to push your needle through. Okay, I have a stitch. So I'm going in with my needle and out. I'm using my thimble to push the needle through. Oops. My needle just came unthreaded. There we go. Okay, if you like, what you can do is you can rule a very light line to keep you on track. So I've just very lightly done that in pencil. so that when I'm holding it, I can see it. Sometimes it's easier to keep it down on the table. Sometimes it's easier to hold it in your hands. You'll have to work out what works for you. So let's look at what I'm doing with my fingers. I've put the needle in, and then I'm using my thimble to push it through like this. I find it's quite helpful to place my thumb very close, my thumbnail, very close to where the needle's coming out. Okay, so this is a running stitch, and I'm going to continue working that all the way along. Can be used as a decorative finish. It's also what you would use if you were hand quilting. So you'll do an entire sample of this running stitch. Okay, there's my running stitch. Now, you'll do a full sample of the running stitch alone. You can also use this to gather fabric. So, take another piece of muslin and do a running stitch just like this. But when you get to the end, we're going to gather it. So you're just literally going to pull this end. You need to make sure it's anchored really well at this end. And pull it up. You can see how it gathers it. Now when we gather things, oftentimes we're actually doing it on the machine, and we'll use a long stitch length to do that. So that's what a gather looks like. So you'll need to produce just a running stitch sample and also a gathered sample. When you want to finish off a row, I'm just going to ungather this so it's flat so you can see. When we want to finish off a row of stitching, we'll take our needle to the back. Okay, I'm going to turn it over. Then you need to just take a little tiny bite of the fabric. This is literally 2 threads of the fabric. So the tiniest stitch ever. Come through, pull it through. Whoops, there's some extra. Here we go. So pull it through until there's a loop. You see that loop? We're going to put our needle through that loop and snug it tight. And can you see it's created that knot? I usually do that a couple of times. So I'm just taking the tiniest amount, pulling it through till there's a loop. Make the loop fairly small. Place your needle through the loop and pull it tight, and it creates a knot at this end. And that's your running stitch sample, and you'll do a separate one of a gathered piece. So you'll gather it up and then secure it with by finishing off with that knot, and you'll have a gathered one too. Okay, let's talk about basting. So what is basting? It is temporary stitching that holds things together. So usually we use that on very fiddly bits where pins maybe aren't going to cut it, or we just want to be really precise. When we hand sew, we have a lot more control than when we machine. So oftentimes we'll baste something by hand and then sew it on the sewing machine. Now, when I baste, I actually use special basting thread. I don't know what the name of this is, but I can get it to you if you're interested. It's got some sort of weird coating on it, and so it's very stiff. You don't have to wax it. Threads really easily and glides through the fabric extremely easily, and when you take it out afterwards, it's also easy to take out. So I use this typically when I'm basting, but obviously you won't be able to see that on that muslin. So I'm just using a much thicker thread so that you can see it easily. Even basting is essentially running stitch, except bigger. I also don't use a knot in the end because it's going to be temporary. I like to be able to take it out easily. So again, I'm going to, when you baste, it doesn't actually have to be very, as straight, because you're not going to see it, but I'm just going to draw a line in just so it looks good for you. So I'm actually just going to start going from here, and I'm just going to take a stitch about 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch long. Okay, the more precise the work is, the closer together your stitch is going to be, the smaller your stitches will be. But it has to be fairly large so that you can take it out easily. So I've pulled it through and left a bit of a tail. Now, I don't want to knot it because I want to be able to take it out, but I do need to anchor it. So I just do one stitch like this, and then I do one more stitch backwards. And we'll get to back stitches in a minute. Okay, that's like formed like a loop. And so then I can pull against that and it's not going to come out. Now, when I baste, I like to have it down on a table, usually if I can, unless it's very fine and curved. And I'm just going to do my running stitch, but big, okay? That's all. And this is an even basting stitch, so the part that goes underneath is going to be about the same size as the part that's on top, okay? Just big kindergarten stitches. Can you see that? Looks the same on the front and on the back. So you can get pretty quick at doing this. You can even kind of pull it part way through, usually if it's gliding through the fabric well, and do a couple and then pull those through like that. I'm not used to having long nails, and it's really interfering with my sewing. Okay, so that's just holding it in place while I do something. To finish it off at the other end, if I need to be secure, again, I'll just do a loop. So I'll go back to this one and then out around that point. So that's our even basting. The next one is uneven basting, and I don't use that very often, to be honest. yeah, I just don't find that I really need it. It's used to like mark in lines and that kind of thing in tailoring, and I don't do proper tailoring, so I don't really use it. But I'll show you how to do it anyway. So you start off the same way. Just anchoring it with that loop. Okay, now for uneven basting, it's basically just drawing a line. It's like to mark something in. So you're going to have a long float on top and a small bite underneath. Long float on top, small bite underneath. So what I'm doing is I'm kind of anchoring it down with my hand. It's funny, you do things kind of automatically, but I need to think about it clearly so I can explain it. So a small bite and then a long float. Okay, and again, just finish it off with a little loop-de-loop like that. Okay, so we have our even basting and our uneven basting. I need to reload my needle. I'm gonna get some of my thread. Thread it through the eye. I find a freshly cut end of thread works quite well. I don't need to like put it in my mouth or something like that. And that can be, not everyone likes that anyway. So, okay, so we're going to do diagonal basting now. So I'm actually going to turn it 90 degrees. We're going to go up here. I suppose I could rule a line as well to keep it neat. I usually don't rule lines for this kind of thing, but there's going to be judgment. Hopefully not too much. Okay, so again, because it's temporary basting, I'm going to anchor it with a little loop. Okay. Now, the diagonal basting is going to go like this up here. So I'm just going to take a sideways bite, completely sideways, always moving from the same side. Okay. This just holds the two pieces of fabric together really well, like laterally. You can do it smaller, like if you're doing, I don't know, like a waistband or something. Okay, that's the diagonal basting. Finish it off again with a little loop. Let's have a look from the back. So this one is the even basting. It looks the same on the front and back because it's essentially a big running stitch. This is the uneven basting. It's got the long floats on the top and little floats on the back, okay? And here's the diagonal basting. I did some big ones and I did some little ones. And on the back, it's just like that. So you can see that they're all a little bit different on the back, and you'll just find that with experience, you'll have a good idea of how you want to hold something together. So that's basting. I've got a double layer of muslin here, and I've got my thread, and it's got a knot on the end. So we're going to do backstitch next. Coming up from the bottom, I've ruled my little line. Okay, so I'm going to be working in this direction. I'm going to go backwards 1 stitch length, and then I'm going to come out, just going to hold it so you can see it, 1 stitch length in front of that thread. You can see it's formed that stitch. The next stitch, I'm going to put my needle in at the end of the former stitch and come out 1 stitch length ahead. Same thing, in at the end of the last stitch, out 1 stitch length ahead. I will say, I think it's really hard to do really neat backstitch with all the stitches perfectly the same length. I find that really hard. Let's have a look at how I'm using the thimble. So I'm always using this side here. I've got the end of the needle against that. Okay. So I'm using it to push through here. Okay, so let's have a look at it from both sides. So this is the front, the top. Could have pulled them a bit tighter maybe. The back looks entirely different. You can see them kind of overlapping on the back. But on the front, it's like stitch, stitch, stitch. They're kind of next to each other. Okay, you will do a whole sample of that. But I'm going to skip ahead and show you the next stitch, which is prick stitch. Prick stitch is very much like backstitch but it's uneven. So almost like the uneven basting. So I'm just going to finish off this row and start again. So going to go through to the back. If there's a convenient thread loop, you can use that, or you can take a little bite of fabric like we did before. Kind of taking a bit of both, pulling it through till there's a loop, passing my needle through the loop and anchoring it. I'm going to do that a couple of times. Oops. There we go. I'm going to cut it off. Okay. I'm going to start again. May not. Okay. So you will have done a whole row of this backstitch, but I'm not going to because I know how to do it. So I'm going to come up on that line somewhere. Okay. Now, instead of going back, I'm going to go back just a little bit, a tiny amount, a prick, okay? And then when I bring the needle forward, I'm going to bring it forward more than I have gone back. So it forms this tiny stitch there. Backwards just a little bit, and forward a longer amount. Backwards a little bit. Oops, I lost the end of my thread. You might have seen that and I didn't notice. There we go. Backwards a little bit. Forward a bit more. Prick stitch is a lovely embellishment stitch around the edges. Instead of top stitching or edge stitching on the machine, you can do it by hand, and it really elevates the finish of a garment. It shows that it's handmade. You can use it for inserting zippers on a dress or a skirt. It's not super duper strong, so if you're using it to for construction, like a zipper, for example, you will want to do them a bit closer together. Okay, so if I were doing it for a zipper, how far would I do it? I guess I would do it pretty close. These long nails are like not doing me any favors. Okay, bring it through to the back. Finish it off, taking a small bite of the fabric, pulling it through so there's a loop, passing my needle through the loop, and knotting. I do like to do that a couple of times. I feel like one time is inviting disaster. Oops, it unthreaded itself. So let's look at, so this is the back stitch, and the wrong side of the back stitch, remember, was kind of like overlapping. This is the prick stitch, okay? I did different lengths of prick stitch to show you. Just a little prick on this side, and then longer floats on the back. And if you look closely, you might see that they are overlapping because it's essentially forming loops. So that is the back stitch and the prick stitch. Okay, I'm set up to show you some embroidery stitches. These ones are not construction based, but they are decorative. So oftentimes you would actually use embroidery thread, like the stranded embroidery thread. I don't have any here, so I'm just using a doubled over thick thread. So I've got the tails about even length. In embroidery, typically you don't knot it, but we're not going to worry about that because we're not actually doing like an embroidery, like painting kind of thing, like an artwork embroidery. But there are other techniques that you can use to anchor the thread for embroidery other than knotting. But for this purposes, we're going to knot it. I'm just going to loop it through twice. Am I? Maybe. Like I said, my nails are really getting in the way. Okay, I'm going to do it once. There we go. Okay, the first one we're going to do is chain stitch. So I've ruled a line, a vertical line. I'm coming up from the bottom. Okay, and I'm holding my thread to this side. Now, I'm going to put my needle in very close, not exactly the same hole, but very, very close to that last where the stitch came out. And I'm moving vertically. I'm going just slightly to this side of that line, And so when I pull it, that thread is looped around. Can you see? So it's forming a loop. The trick here is you don't want to pull it too tightly. This is chain stitch. It's going to make like a chain. For the next one, I'm going to hold that thread to this side. Okay. Again, I'm going to go in just next to where that came out. And I'm going to move up the same distance as before, or as close as I can. I'm going to keep that loop looped around. My needle's passing over the top of that thread. I'm pulling, oops, my tails aren't even. So let me fix that. Sometimes this happens when you're working in doubled thread. One will end up a bit shorter. So can you see how one of the loops is bigger? So I need to figure out which one that is, and I'm just snugging it up. So we've got that chain, okay? Just to fix that, I'm just running my fingers down to make them even again, but I'm just was holding on securely here so that it didn't pull this really tight. If you pull it really tight, it ends up being, it loses its loop chain quality. So holding the thread on this side, putting my needle in just next to where I was, and creating a chain. Okay, just next to it. Okay, remember not to pull too tight. Oops, looped around the fabric there. And you can play with it with your needle. Okay, embroidery thread does hold together a bit better than this just doubled top stitching thread. So you won't have it, it won't look quite so much as though it's two pieces of thread when you do it, but I hope you can see well. So that's chain stitch. Okay, just say I'm going to end here. You'll do a full sample. I need to anchor this last loop. So I'm just going to take a stitch over the top of that last loop and down to the back. So over the top, just to basically hold it down in place. Oops, it's knotted. When you get a little snag like this, take your needle and just kind of back it off a bit. Try and undo that snag. I'm holding the previous stitches securely. There we go. So I was just able to undo that snag with my needle. It's uneven again, so I'm just going to play with these two tails, see which one it is. It's one of these. Is it that one? You can see I've got that extra little loop there. So it's not, so I'll try the other one. There we go. And so can you see that's just been secured down? Again, to end it, it's going to take a tiny bit. That won't even be visible from the other side. And knot it. Of course, it's needs some remedy here. There we go. And I'm going to cut it off. There's my chain stitch. I'm set up for my blanket stitch. I've got 2 lines ruled parallel. I'm going to work in this direction. I've knotted my thread and I brought it up from the back. Now, I will say that I find the first stitch always ends up kind of diagonal, but that's okay. So we're keeping the thread to this side, kind of like with the chain stitch, and then we're going to put our needle in a distance away from this stitch and bring it up to the other line. Okay. And my needle is passing over the top. Okay. So that first stitch, it's always diagonal like this. Don't worry about that. After that, things will even out and you'll see. Holding the thread here, going to put my needle in and then out on that second line. I'm trying to keep the stitches along here an even distance apart. Okay, holding it here. Again, we're not going to pull it super duper tight. It kind of makes like two sides of a square shape. You might recognize this from the edges of a blanket, which is why it's called blanket stitch. So you can do it over the edge of a raw edge, which kind of helps hold these frays in, okay? Just holding it here. Needle passing over the top. Oops, my threads have split. Okay, you'll do a whole row of that. I'm going to end it. I'm just going to put my needle down there just to anchor that. Just going through the thread loop this time actually to form a knot. There we go. So that's our chain stitch and our blanket stitch. Chain stitch looks like that on the back, blanket stitch looks like this on the back.